Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to spend a lot of time looking at the biggest organ of the integumentary system, which is the skin. And notice that the skin is considered to have, it says 3 major regions, and then it only tells you 2. There's actually 2 major regions, but the third one, which is the hypodermis, is not technically considered a part of the skin. So that's why it says 3, but it only mentions 2. So the 2 major regions of the skin itself is going to be the epidermis, which is the outermost region, and below the epidermis is the dermis, which is the middle region. The epidermis is made of epithelial tissue, specifically keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. The dermal layer, on the other hand, is made of connective tissue. And the dermal layer will be the thickest part of the skin. Now, the hypodermis, or superficial fascia, is not technically considered part of the skin, but is always talked about in the context of the skin and is always depicted in pictures of the skin. So that's why we go ahead and throw it in there. The hypodermis is made mostly of adipose tissue, which is one of the forms of connective tissue. So if you look at a picture of the skin right here, you can see that the top layer of the skin is the epidermis, and the epidermis consists of epithelial tissue, more specifically keratinized, stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And notice that this is a very thin layer, actually, compared to the dermal layer, which is the connective tissue layer. So this entire layer down here will be the dermis, and we'll talk about the 2 layers of the dermis. Okay, and notice that most of the structures that we associate with skin, like sweat glands and hair and receptors, most of them are going to be found in the dermal layer. Also notice that the epidermal layer, the epidermis, is epithelial tissue, and as such, it doesn't have any blood vessels. You don't see blood vessels until you go into the dermal layer. Again, just to reiterate, the last layer is the hypodermis, which, as we mentioned before, is not technically a part of the skin. It's made of adipose tissue, which is a form of connective tissue, and it is always mentioned when we go over the skin, but technically speaking is part of the superficial fascia. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these 2 layers one at a time, and we'll talk about the epidermis first. Now, the epidermis is made of epithelial tissue. You do have to know the specific type of epithelial tissue, keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Now, remember that the epithelial tissue has a couple of characteristics. One of them is that it's avascular, and that's why it needs the connective tissue underneath to support it and give it nutrients and oxygen. Another characteristic of epithelial tissue is that it is cellular tissue, meaning that it's made of cells, layers and layers of cells, and this is stratified tissue. The types of cells that we find in the epidermis are keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are the most abundant types of cells found in the epidermis. The name comes from keratin, which is a protein that these cells produce. At the bottom layer of the epidermis, there's a population of cells called the basal cells. Basal cells are stem cells, also called germ cells. These are very, very young cells that are constantly replicating. As they replicate, the older daughter cells are pushed to the surface. And so the daughters of the basal cells are the keratinocytes. Interdispersed with the basal cells is another population of cells called melanocytes. So basal cells and melanocytes are found in the same area of the epidermis. Melanocytes are cells that produce a pigment called melanin that gives the skin its color, but more importantly, melanin is able to absorb UV light, which skin, the epidermis of the skin, being at the surface, is subject to the effects of UV light, which is a mutagen. Melanin is going to absorb the UV light and reduce the damage that UV light could cause. A population of immune system cells called Langerhans cells, which are macrophages, are also found in the epidermis. And then finally, the epidermal layer also has some touch receptors. Most of the touch receptors are going to be on the dermis, except for the Merkel cells, which are found on the epidermis. So as you can see in this picture, the epidermis consists of a thick layer of cells. This is at least 30 or more layers of cells. And the deepest layer is down here. That's where we're going to find the basal cells and the melanocytes. Notice that these cells color darker because they're younger and they take on most of the dye. This right here will be dermis. Okay. Notice then that after this basal layer, there is a thick layer of cells, and these cells are round at the beginning, and then they begin to flatten as they age. This is the layer of keratinocytes. Langerhans cells are also found roaming around on this layer. And then there's another distinct layer that you can see right here, in which the cells are flat. And if you see carefully, you'll notice that they have granules inside. So this is yet another layer in which these keratinocytes have again aged and changed into a distinct layer of cells. There is another distinct layer right there. This is a bit of a lighter area. Again, keratinocytes have died by then, and you can see this thin layer of dead cells at this light area right here. And then we have a very thick layer of dead cells, dead keratinocytes, that are beginning to disintegrate, and they may not even look like cells anymore. So you can see how the epidermis is made of layers of cells. Each of these layers are going to be called a strata, and they're going to have names. And so part of what this part of the chapter deals with are these different strata of epidermal cells. So we're going to go over these cells first. We mentioned the melanocytes, which are found at the bottom of the epidermal layers. They're found together with basal cells. About 10 to 25% of the cells in the lower epidermis are going to be melanocytes. Melanocytes produce a pigment called melanin. And you can see how these square cells here will be the basal cells, and these funny looking cells right here in green are the melanocytes. Notice that the melanocytes put out these extensions of their cytoplasm, that, and they have the granules inside, the melanin granules, and here and there some parts of the cytoplasm pinch off, and they are sent upwards towards the layer of living cells. These vesicles are filled with melanin, and the melanin is going to position strategically on top of the nuclei of keratinocytes, protecting the nuclei from UV light radiation. So that's those are the melanocytes. Another cells that we found in the epidermis were the immune system cells, called cells of Langerhans. They're also called epidermal dendritic cells. These are these cells right here, which actually move about, looking for debris, dead cells, bacteria, just things to eat. Down here, this orange cell is the melanocyte, and the purple cells are the basal cells. Okay. This is labeled as Langerhans cell. Oh, never mind. This is Langerhans cell. Okay, much better. All right. Okay, the other cells found in the epidermis are going to be the tactile receptors. You can see them here. These are Merkel cells, and these are the only tactile receptors found in the epidermis. So what we're going to do is we're going to start looking at all of the different types of layers that we find in the epidermis. We call the layers strata. Strata is plural. Stratum is going to be singular. And as we go through the strata, you need to note the cells found in strata, the characteristics of the cells, the thickness of the strata, and whether the strata is found in thick skin only, thin skin only, or both. And most of the strata are going to be found in both thick and thin skin. So let me show you what we mean by thick and thin skin. I'm going to skip to a PowerPoint that's a little bit below. That shows you thick and thin skin. So these two pictures are showing you thick skin on the left-hand side, thin skin on the right-hand side. So thick skin is found in two places: palms of the hands and sole of the feet. So the parts where we have calluses. When you think of thick skin, think of calluses. Everywhere else, were thought of having thin skin. So this is thick skin, and the epidermal layer of this thick skin is right here. Notice that the layer of dead cells is huge compared to the layer of dead cells in thin skin. Here you see at the very bottom the basal layer, and this will be the layer of keratinocytes right here. Then again, the layer becomes darker, and that will be the layer of cells with granules. And notice that above the layer of cells with granules, there's this clearing right here, which you don't see on thin skin. So this is the layer that is only found in thick skin. Thin skin will have all of the other layers, and the layer of dead cells will be thinner. Think of layers of skin like the eyelids. The skin in the eyelids, for example, is very, very, very thin. It would have a very thin layer of dead cells. On the other hand, the skin of the arms, for example, or the elbow or the knees will have a thicker layer of dead tissue. So these are considered thin skin areas, but the layers of dead tissue may vary in thin skin. All right, so let's start with the strata. And this is a nice PowerPoint that shows you all the different strata. At the bottom, we're going to have the deepest strata, which is the stratum basale or germinativum. It has two names. You need to be able to recognize both names. And this is one layer thick of cells, or thin, I should say. The stratum spinosum is superficial to the stratum basale. Then comes the stratum granulosum, which is the layer of cells that have the granules. Then the stratum lucidum above is the strata that's only found in thick skin. And then the strata of dead cells is called the stratum corneum. Think of the corns of the feet, for example, and that reminds you of the stratum corneum. Corns on the feet are made of dead tissue cells. You should be able to list these layers from deep to superficial, or from superficial to deep, whichever you're asked to do. And pay attention as to whether they're asking to list these layers in thick skin or thin skin. And the difference will be that in thick skin, you're going to mention the stratum lucidum. In thin skin, you will skip the stratum lucidum. So there are a couple of PowerPoints like this one in which they give you each of the layers and the characteristics of each layer summarized. So we're going to start on the deepest layer, which is the stratum basale, or the basal layer. Remember, this is also called the stratum germinativum. This is a single row of stem cells and melanocytes. So these are going to be germ cells that are constantly dividing. They're young cells. They undergo rapid division. The older cells will be pushed to the more superficial layer. It takes about a little over a month for cells to travel from the basal layer to the top layers. So essentially, keratinocytes, these cells are going to live a little over a month before they are dead, and then they're shed. The next layer is the stratum spinosum. This is spinosum means prickly. So this is the prickly layer. The cells are called keratinocytes. And in this layer, we're also going to find the immune system cells, the Langerhans cells. The keratinocytes are alive, and therefore they have to be protected from UV light. So they're going to be covered by these melanin granules that are put out by the melanocytes in the stratum basale. The layers of the stratum spinosum vary between 8 and 10, depending on the kind of the skin. The name comes from what happens to these cells when they are prepared to be viewed under the microscope, and they are flooded with alcohol to prepare this light. And what happens to these cells when they are flooded with alcohol is that the cells shrink. And these are epithelial cells in which there are connections between the cells. So as the cells shrink, the areas where they're connected remain. And so they look like they have these spiny areas like that. And that's where the name comes in. Okay, so superficial to the stratum spinosum is the next strata, which is the stratum granulosum. This is a thin layer with 3 to 5 layers of cells. By this time, the cells are definitely flat. They're dying. They're losing their organelles and nuclei, and they're making and accumulating keratin. Keratin is a protein. Keratohyalin and lamellated granules is what accumulates in this granulosa layer. So the cells begin to look different because they're in the process of dying and accumulating keratin. The layer superficial to the stratum granulosum is the stratum lucidum. This is the layer that is only found on thick skin. It is a clear layer. And at that point, the cells are a few rows of flat, dead cells. So these are dead keratinocytes. They still look like cells, however, and so they haven't lost their shape yet. The stratum corneum, on the other hand, now we have a thick layer of dead, flat cells. They're completely keratinized, and oftentimes they don't even look like cells anymore. They just look like fibers. Most of the epidermis will be made by this stratum corneum. The function of the epidermis is carried out by the stratum corneum. So this thick layer of dead cells protects the skin. It becomes a protection from mechanical abrasion. Keratin is waterproof, meaning that water cannot penetrate the skin. However, it does allow for evaporation of water. It minimizes water loss, however. So we would have a lot more evaporation and dehydration of the skin if the keratin layer was not there. Keratin is very tough, and more importantly, microorganisms cannot break it up. So it represents a barrier against biological infections. Bacteria cannot break up keratin. Now, fungus can, and so sometimes we do get fungal infections in the skin. But in general, for a bacteria to be able to infect the skin, it will need some type of mechanical injury that will allow it to go into deeper tissues, because the keratin doesn't allow for these cells bacterial cells to live. The keratinized layer also represents a protection from chemical and physical Okay, so again, you should know the layers and the characteristics of the layer, the cells found in each layer, and the thickness of the layers. Remember, again, stratum lucidum is only found in thick skin. Other than that, all the other strata are found in both thick skin and thin skin. Okay. If there are no questions, I'll move on to skin color and the factors influences skin color. So blood circulation would influence the skin color, as would certain components like vitamins. Carotene is the storage form of vitamin A. Thickness of the skin can also influence the skin color. Hormones sometimes may change the skin color, especially estrogen. And then obviously the most important factor in the skin color is the presence of melanin. So we'll talk about melanin first. And melanin is this yellow to reddish to brown pigment made by melanocytes. The melanocytes package the melanin into vesicles, little bags called melanosomes. And the melanosomes break off from the melanocyte, and they're sent to the upper layers, the stratum spinosum, to protect the keratinocytes in that layer. So the melanosomes are distributed to keratinocytes in the stratum spinosum. The purpose of melanin is to absorb UV light. UV light is radiation. It is damaging to DNA. It could cause mutations that may lead to cancer. So in order to protect the DNA of keratinocytes, melanin is positioned on top of the nuclei of these cells. The way the pigment works is it absorbs UV light, and actually UV light stimulates melanocytes into producing more melanin, and that's why the skin tans when is exposed to UV light. Now, too much exposure could burn the skin. The exposure has to be gradual to stimulate production of melanin. So again, there's a little depiction of melanocytes. So this is important. If you're asked the function of melanin and all you answer is to give a skin the color, Well, that's not a complete answer. You could even argue that's an incorrect answer, in the sense that that is not the main function of melanin. The main function of melanin is to absorb UV light to protect the cells from UV light damage. So that is the reason for the melanin. It just so it happens that it's a pigment that also gives the skin a color. This will be the reason why people that are from tropical areas that will be exposed to a lot of UV light would have darker skin than those people that live in colder climates, northern climates, let's say Northern Europe, where there is less sunlight. As a matter of fact, half the year they don't even have sunlight. So there isn't as much of the problem with UV light. So they don't need as much melanin. So evolutionarily speaking, they have less. They have a skin that is lighter because they don't need the protection from UV light. What they need is exposure to UV light to make vitamin D. People that live in areas that are very sunny, they need protection from the UV light. They're not. The making of vitamin D is not much of a problem because there's plenty of sunlight. So we'll talk about this also again when we talk about vitamin D in a few PowerPoints. So you should know the function of melanin. Okay. Another point is that the number of melanocytes is roughly equal among all races. What changes is the ability of the melanocyte to produce melanin. So the darker the skin, the more active the melanocytes are in producing melanin. There is a genetic mutation that may occur in all races, in which the gene that produces the enzyme needed to make melanin is mutated, is damaged, so the person cannot produce melanin. The condition is called albinism, and you probably know what a person that suffers from this condition looks like. It would have white hair, very light skin. The eyes have no pigment because the pigment in the eyes is also melanin. So the problem with albinism is that the lack of melanin renders the person susceptible to UV light damage. So they have to wear eye protection and they have to protect their skin because they don't have the protective feature of melanin. Freckles, on the other hand, are localized accumulation of melanin that creates that darker coloration. All right, so melanin is one of the main factors that affect the skin color. Another one could be something like carotene. Carotene is the storage form of vitamin A. And because carotene and vitamin A is a fat-soluble substance, it is going to be stored in fat tissue. So remember that the hypodermis, which is below the dermis, is fat tissue, and that will be one of the places where carotene will be stored. If there is an excess of carotene being stored, the orangey color of carotene will be seen through the skin, and the skin will have an orange color. So this happens sometimes to children that start eating too many carrots. Their skin will turn orange due to the accumulation of carotene. This is not harmful. Carotene is not toxic. Vitamin A could be toxic. Carotene is not, but vitamin A could be. So carotene itself, the storage form, is not a toxic substance, so it's not necessarily dangerous. It just looks a little weird. Okay, so storage of carotene in fat tissue and melanin are two of the factors that affect the skin color. Another one is going to be a hemoglobin or blood circulation. And this is especially important in lighter skin. Sometimes excessive blood circulation it makes the skin reddish. That's called erythema. That could be a condition due to some type of abnormal condition, like an autoimmune condition, for example. Sometimes causes eczema, and that is shown as that reddish coloration. The opposite of too much hemoglobin in the skin will be a lack of circulation, and that gives the skin a bluish tint, which is especially noticed in light color skin. It is especially noticeable in the lips and in the nails. So this is maybe due to lack of circulation. It could be due to lack of oxygen. Some type of heart problem sometimes gives the color. Sometimes babies are born with heart problems and they're born with a bluish color. They're called cyanotic or blue babies. So cyanosis is the bluish coloration to the skin, especially lips and nails, due to a lack of circulation. Another term that describes changes in skin color, abnormal skin colors, is jaundice. And jaundice is a yellow coloration in the skin due to a substance called bilirubin. So what happens is that every day our spleen destroys millions of red blood cells. And part of the end product of the destruction of hemoglobin is bilirubin. Bilirubin is a toxic product that is sent via blood to the liver. And the liver will detoxify bilirubin, and we're going to excrete it in feces. We also excrete it in urine, and that's why urine is yellow. It's because of bilirubin. So everything is fine unless the liver stops working properly. Then bilirubin accumulates in blood and begins to seep out of blood and go into the skin and gives the skin a yellow coloration called jaundice. You can also see it in the white of the eyes. In an adult, this type of condition is typically indicative of liver disease. In newborns, sometimes newborns are born jaundiced, and then it's typically due to some increased red blood cell destruction due to some form of blood incompatibility between mother and child. And so the baby is born with some form of antibody from the mother that is destroying the red blood cells. There is too much bilirubin. There is a young liver that cannot handle the excess bilirubin, and the baby turns yellow. So you should know what jaundice is and the conditions that can cause jaundice. Okay, now you're going to have to excuse me for 1 second. I need to run, go do something, and I'm going to be right back. We're going to go next to the dermis. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so dermis. The dermis is the second layer of the skin, and when you get a tattoo, that's the layer where the pigment goes, which makes sense because if you were to put it in the epidermis, it will disappear within a matter of a couple of months. This is the thicker part of the skin. It is made of connective tissue, so it is strong and flexible. Remember, connective tissue has fibers, collagen fibers and elastic fibers. So remember, the dermis is connective tissue, and connective tissue has two components. It has cells, and it has matrix. Sorry, it has matrix. And then the matrix has two components, ground substance and protein fibers. So the cells of the dermis are fibroblasts. And fibroblasts are young cells that make the ground substance and the protein fibers. Other cells found in the dermis are going to be immune system cells, like macrophages, for example, mast cells, other white blood cells. The reason why is because these cells are going to constitute what we're going to call the second line of defense. If you think about it, the epidermis is the first line of defense. The keratin in the epidermis is so tough and protective that microorganisms cannot go through unless there is some type of mechanical damage. Other than that, there's no way for microorganisms to go past the epidermal layer into the dermal layer. But if something happens, if there is some form of damage, and microorganisms can go through the epidermis, now they're going to find the second line of defense, which are these immune system cells that are hopefully going to prevent the infection from proceeding into deeper parts of the body, into gaining access to blood vessels and become systemic. These cells are going to localize the infection and hopefully get rid of it. So these cells will constitute what we call the second line of defense. So it's a very important function of the dermal layer. Now, the dermal layer is actually made of two regions, two layers, what we call the papillary dermis and the reticular dermis. The papillary dermis is made of areolar connective tissue, and this is what we call the lamina propria, which we talked about in chapter 4. This is the layer of connective tissue that is always found under epithelial tissue. This is a thin layer, and it is a supportive layer. The reticular dermis is the thicker part. It's made of dense, irregular connective tissue with thick collagen fibers and elastic fibers. The part of the dermis the layer that gives the dermis its resilience is the reticular dermis. because if you think about it, you take this skin and you stretch it and then you let it go and it goes back to its original shape. That's thanks to the collagen and the elastic fibers, especially, that we find in the reticular dermis. If those fibers were to break, now you'll have stretch marks, for example. So again, the dermis is made of two layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. The papillary layer is thin. It's about this thickness right there. Most of the dermis will be the reticular layer of the dermis. Okay, so a couple of things here. First of all, when it comes to the test, read questions carefully. If a question asks about dermal layers, what the question is asking about are the papillary layer or the reticular layer. If a question asks about epidermal strata, or sometimes epidermal layers, but now we're talking about epidermal. Now we're talking about the stratum germinativum, stratum spinosum, granulosum, etc. So if it is a multiple choice question and the question is about epidermal strata, don't even consider the papillary layers as a possible answer. If, on the other hand, the question asks about dermal layers, don't consider epidermal strata as possible answers. So be careful and read the question and don't let the terms confuse you. So that's one thing. The other point I wanted to make is, now we're going to take the papillary and the reticular layer separately and talk about each. Papillary layer, the word papilla, is a word that we use a lot in biology because papilla is describing this wavy shape that you see right there. Okay, so that's why the papillary layer is called the dermal papilla. Is because of its shape, that waves that this layer creates. And notice over here, I'm going to go down a little bit. Down here, you can see this dermal papilla right there. And notice that the epidermal layer also has papilla, which now we're going to call ridges. And they complement the dermal papilla so that they interlock with each other and they're going to produce friction ridges, or better known as fingerprints. Okay, so that's what produces the lines that you see in the skin, are these interlocking between the epidermal ridges and the dermal papilla ridges. So that's the reason for the name papillary layer. Now, the papillary layer is made of irregular connective tissue, and that should be expected because this is the tissue that is always found first under epithelial tissue. This tissue had all three types of fibers: collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. There will be lots of little blood vessels, capillaries, which are going to nourish the epidermis above. The papillary layer is also going to have touch receptors called Meissner's corpuscles and free nerve endings, so other types of receptors. Now, reticular layer, that's the thickest layer of the dermis. Again, the name reticular is another one of those favorite terms for biologists. Reticular means net-like. So we had the reticular connective tissue, for example, found in the spleen. So that was a net-like tissue. In this case, we're not talking about reticular tissue, we're talking about the reticular layer of the dermis. So the word reticular is describing this layer of the dermis. This has nothing to do with reticular connective tissue. The layer itself is actually made of dense, irregular connective tissue, and that was in another PowerPoint. So this is dense, irregular connective tissue. And one of the characteristics of dense, irregular connective tissue were these huge, thick bundles of collagen fibers that were positioned in irregular or varied directions. The collagen fibers provide the strength and resilience characteristics of the tissue. So again, you can stretch it and it's not going to break. And the elastic fibers provide the recoil properties. So you let it go and goes back to its original shape. The thick layers of collagen, the thick bundles of collagen in the dermis all over the body are arranged as tension lines. So they're going to arrange in the direction where that skin is more likely to stretch. So that if you look at a map of the dermis, of the particular dermis throughout the body, you're going to see what surgeons call cleavage lines. So these cleavage lines are mapped out over the skin of the body, all over the body, and surgeons know the direction of the cleavage lines so that they know to make their incisions parallel the cleavage lines, and that's going to reduce scarring. If you cut across cleavage lines, it will be harder for the dermis to repair, and you'll end up with a scar, with a worse scar. So you should know what we mean by cleavage lines and what's the importance of these lines. Okay. If any questions? Okay, so I'm going to move on to glands. And actually what this last portion is going to look at is going to be the other organs of the integumentary system, which will be sweat glands, oil glands, hairs, hair follicles, and nails. Okay, so sweat glands are also called sudoriferous glands. You should know that. And sweat glands come in two types. Eccrine or merocrine sweat glands are the ones that are the most common, the ones that are located all over the body. They secrete a watery type of sweat, and they're especially abundant in the palms of the hands, the sole of the feet, and the forehead. And these are the, when we think of sweat, this is what when we think of these these eccrine glands producing this watery material. The other type of sudoriferous glands are called apocrine sweat glands, and they are located in specific parts of the body, mainly under the arms, the axillary area, the pubic area, and the genital area, and they secrete an oily and proteinaceous type of secretion that starts being made at puberty due to the actions of sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So eccrine glands secrete the watery sweat, mostly water, some antibacterial properties, some metabolic waste. The function is thermoregulation and some excretion of waste. Okay, so this, when we talked about sweat in thermoregulation, this is the sweat that creates the sensible perspiration produced by eccrine or merocrine sweat glands. And there's a depiction of those little glands in the dermis. The other type of sweat gland are the apocrine sweat glands. They secrete a mixture of oil called sebum plus the fatty, protein, a protein that smells. And they start working at puberty, so they are sexually scent glands. Other forms of specialized sweat glands will be ceruminous glands, and ceruminous glands create the cerumen or wax found in the external ear. Mammary glands are another modification of sweat glands. So those are the sebaceous, sweat glands, the sudoriferous glands. Sebaceous or oil glands are found all over the body. Most of them are associated with hair follicles. They become active at puberty, again to the actions of sex hormones. So testosterone and estrogen at puberty stimulate sebaceous glands and apocrine sweat glands. They are, sebum is the oil that these glands secrete. It is an oily holocrine secretion, meaning that the entire cell ruptures and is put out. So these glands have to be constantly regenerating themselves. The oil has a bactericidal property because it has acids, and fatty acids, which deter the growth of bacteria, but obviously not all, because we do get pimples. Also has a function softening the hair and the skin. And that is what the glands look like. And again, we're going to see them as associated with hair follicles. Not all of the sweat gland of the oil glands are going to be associated with hair follicles, but many of them are. So you should know what sebaceous glands are and their location. When it comes to hair and nails, I will spend a little bit of time on hair and not very much time on nails. Functions of hair will be to protection against physical trauma, heat loss, sunlight. they also, each little hair has a little nerve ending wrapped around the hair follicle. So we can essentially feel each little hair in our bodies. So the function of that is to alert the body of the presence of something crawling on the skin, for example. Hair is made of dead tissue, of dead keratinized cells. So this is epithelial tissue. And then there will be some supporting connective tissue underneath. Let's see. The keratin found in hair is slightly different. It's more durable than the soft keratin in the skin. We also find melanocytes in hair, and the melanin produced by these melanocytes vary greatly in color, more so than the melanin produced by skin melanocytes. Gray hair comes from a decrease in melanin production. Also, over time, air bubbles accumulate in the hair shaft, and that also gives it the white appearance. Okay, so this is a cross section of a hair follicle, and the follicle itself is mostly connective tissue. You can see it here, this blue sac-like structure made of connective tissue that envelops the actual hair. The actual hair is mostly epithelial tissue. You can see here the darker layer where the basal cells and the melanocytes will be located. Again, another depiction of the hair follicle with the hair inside. So the follicle will be the covering, and the hair itself will be inside. Hair has an expanded end called the hair bulb, and the attached to the hair follicle will be a muscle called the erector pili muscle. It's a smooth muscle. And again, we talk about a sensory nerve ending attached to each hair follicle. This will be a longitudinal cut of the hair, and you can see here the follicle, and then this will be the actual hair over here. These are the little melanocytes right there. This is connective tissue that brings in blood vessels to feed the hair. Okay. The body has two types of hairs. Delos is the fine hair that you see on the skin, and the terminal hair is the hair found in on the scalp, under the armpits, the pubic area, etc. So it's a thicker type of hair. Alopecia refers to the thinning of the hair that occurs as we age. So what happens is that hair follicles are constantly losing the little hair and producing a new hair. And this happens throughout our life. But as we age, some of the hair follicles atrophy, and when they lose the hair, they do not regenerate. And that's why the hair thins as we age. What we actually call baldness is a genetically determined condition. It's a sex-linked condition, and that's typically due to testosterone. And some of the testosterone gets converted to a substance called DHT, the hydrotestosterone, which is damaging to hair follicles. So that's essentially what happens during baldness. Okay. Nails are, again, made of keratinized epithelial cells. So the part of the nail that is actually live tissue is going to reside under the cuticle, and these little epidermal cells, epithelial cells, will begin to divide, and the older dead cells are the ones that protrude out, the keratinized cells, dead cells, as actual nails. So the part of the hair that protrudes out of the scalp, the shaft, is going to be made of dead cells, dead keratinized cells. The nails or the cells that protrude out into the surface of the fingers, what we call nails, are also keratinized dead cells. So we spend a lot of time and money taking care of a whole bunch of dead cells. Okay. All right, so that takes care of the anatomy and explaining what these organs are that we find in the integumentary system. We're going to revisit the functions of the skeletons of the integumentary system. And the obvious function is protection. That's probably the first thing that comes to mind when we think of the skin. And so the skin represents a very protective barrier against mechanical abrasion, it's against chemical damage, against physical damage. Protects against chemicals, against bacteria, protects against chemical damage, again, physical damage, biological damage. Okay. The other function of the skin, which we have talked about at length, and yet again, we bring it up one more time, is thermoregulation. So the skin is involved in cooling the body when the temperature elevates. Sweat will cool the body, and also the blood vessels of the skin are going to dilate to allow for loss of heat through the skin. At low temperatures, the blood vessels of the skin is going to constrict to prevent heat loss through the skin. So this PowerPoint shows you here, this is normal blood flow. I notice that there's a lot of blood flow in the middle of the body. During hyperthermia, blood flow is diverted to the peripheral blood vessels on the skin. The middle doesn't have as much blood flow, and this is going to allow for the dissipation of heat through the skin. So in case you've forgotten, again, review what happens during hyperthermia when temperature increases, skin blood vessels dilate to lose heat, and sweat glands begin to produce sweat to cool the skin. Temperature goes back down. During hypothermia, now blood vessels on the skin are going to shrink to prevent heat loss. The skeletal muscle will begin to move, to shiver, and that hopefully will bring the temperature back up. So review thermoregulation again. Another function of the skin is to provide sensation. We have extra receptors, we have temperature receptors, pain receptors, touch receptors in the skin. Another function of the skin is metabolic. This is the place where synthesis of vitamin D is going to begin to start. Synthesis of vitamin D is going to actually require UV light. So that is the dichotomy. That's the problem that we have with UV light. On the one hand, UV light is going to produce damage, mutations in cells, so we need to be protected against it. On the other hand, we need it to begin synthesis of vitamin D in the skin. Vitamin D is a complex vitamin. Its synthesis begins in the skin, then it continues on in the liver and the kidneys. But the beginning process is in the skin. We're going to talk more about vitamin D in the next chapter because it is important in the absorption of calcium from the intestines. Now we know that it's also important in the conversion of carcinogens and protections from carcinogens. So it is a crucial vitamin. And so we need sunlight in order to make vitamin D, but too much sunlight will create mutations that may lead to skin cancer. So another point is do not confuse vitamin D with vitamin A. Remember, vitamin A in the form of carotene is stored in the skin. Vitamin D is synthesized by the skin. So keep those vitamins straight. A couple of other functions of the skin is it represents a reservoir for blood. About 5% of the blood at all times will be found in the skin. That's why blood can be diverted from the skin if it's needed to the center of the body to organs, or it can be moved away from the center of the body to the skin blood vessels if needed. The last function is excretion of waste. Nitrogenous waste especially are excreted via the skin, or some of it is excreted via the skin. Most of it is through urine, but some of it we get rid of it through the skin. Okay, so the last part of the PowerPoints I'm going to talk about is skin cancer and burns, so damage to the skin. If there are no questions, go ahead and proceed. Okay, so when it comes to skin cancer, you should know the risk factors for skin cancer. You probably already know exposure to UV light or irritants, like chemicals, for example. All right, so there's 3 basic types of skin cancer. These are the major types: basal cell carcinomas, squamous cell carcinomas, and melanomas. Notice that they're named after the cells in the epidermis that cause the cancer. So basal cell carcinomas are the most common, the least malignant. They are made by the basal cells in the basal layer, which begin to proliferate and cause a lesion, a little tumor. It is 99% of the cases, it is eliminated by surgical removal. So it is a very common type of skin cancer. It doesn't metastasize, and so that's why it's not a malignant type of cancer, in that it doesn't metastasize. That represents a basal cell carcinoma lesion. It typically happens in people with fair skin, and it appears in areas that protrude out, like the nose, which those are the areas that are more sensitive to UV light. All right. The second most common type of skin cancer is a squamous cell carcinoma. In this case, the squamous epithelial cells are the ones responsible for the cancer. These are the keratinocytes in the stratum spinosum. This cancer is a little bit more serious. It doesn't metastasize, but it does grow. So it needs to be removed by surgery, followed by some form of radiation. Again, it appears in areas that are more subjected to UV light, like the ears, the nose, hands, etc. And this is what the lesion looks like. It looks like an open wound that doesn't heal. Okay. Now, the most serious type of cancer is the melanoma. Melanomas are one of the worst types of cancers, actually. They are made by melanocytes. And think about these. A melanocyte is a cell that produces a radiation-resistant. So right off the bat, this kind of cancer is going to be resistant to radiation. It is also resistant to chemotherapy, and that's what makes it so deadly. It metastasizes very quickly. Again, these are cells that put out extensions, and the extensions grow throughout. Well, from there to the whole cell dislodging and beginning to travel, the cell is close to the dermis, where we find blood vessels. So again, it is a very deadly type of cancer. The best way to treat it is to get it early on, when it can be removed through excision, and maybe some radiation and chemotherapy will finish it up. It is very important to know how to identify a melanoma lesion. And dermatologists have made this easy way to identify it, to explain it. It's called the ABCD rule. A stands for asymmetry. So a melanoma region is going to be asymmetric. So if you look in your body for a little freckle, the freckles are typically round. And if you were to make a line in between, the two sides will be roughly the same. In a melanoma lesion, the lesion is misshapen. So when you divide it in half, the two sides are not going to be the same. So it's asymmetric. B stands for border. Again, when you look at a lesion, a little freckle in your body, the borders are going to be even. Okay. In a melanoma region, the borders are indented. So this is an uneven border. Okay, and I'll show you a picture here in just a second. C stands for color. There's typically a couple of colors present, brown and black or tan, etc. Most freckles are one color. The diameter is D, and these are typically large lesions, about 6 millimeters, which is the size of a pencil eraser. So take a look at this picture of a melanoma lesion. A stood for asymmetry. So notice that the lesion is asymmetric. Okay, so it's not the same on one side as it is on the other side. The B stands for borders. Notice that the borders are uneven. C stood for color, at least two kinds of colors. And D for diameter, which is large, about the size of a pencil eraser. Definitely know what the ABCD rule is and what it stands for, and the description of a melanoma lesion. Okay. So the other type of skin lesion or damage that we're going to talk about are burns. And burns that can be due to fire, or they can be due to chemicals. And it represents a damage to the skin. Now, the problem with burns, the threat of a burn, is not just the destruction of the tissue itself. The tissue will repair, or if it's not too extensive, it will repair by itself. The problem with a burn is couplefold. First of all, we're going to remove the first and oftentimes second line of defense of the body. So now we're going to be subject to infections. If that's not enough, when you remove the epidermis of the skin, now you're going to be subject to dehydration. If you have dehydration, you're also going to have electrolyte imbalance, which will damage the kidneys. and could bring about low blood pressure, which will be depicted as shock. So circulatory shock means low blood pressure, extremely low blood pressure. So in order to assess the level of burns, doctors have created this rule of nines, in which the body is divided into 9% portions, and that way they can look at the extension of the burn and quickly assess the percentage of the body that has been burned. So this is the rule of 9. The front of the head is 4.5%, the back will be the other 4.5%, and that will give you the 9% of the head and neck. The upper extremities is 4.5% for the front, 4.5% for the back, so it's 9% for one of the upper extremities, 9% for the other upper extremity. That's 18% for the limbs, for the upper limbs. The lower limbs is 9% for the front, 9% for the back, so that's 18% for each, which gives you 36% for the lower limbs. The trunk is represented by two 9% regions at the front, two 9% regions at the back, so that's 36%. So if you add up all these, you get the 100%. And so by looking at the extension of the burns, very quickly they can assess the severity of the burn. So a first-degree burn is the least severe. This is just a damage in the epidermal layer only. It is characterized by redness, edema, and pain. And notice there is no blistering, at least there is no immediate blistering. So in this example, the tips of the finger have been burned with a first-degree burn. A second-degree burn is characterized by the same signs and symptoms as the first-degree burn, plus a blister that appears immediately. And this is because the epidermal layer and the dermal layer have been damaged, and the two layers are going to separate, and fluid, due to the inflammation, will accumulate in the middle of both layers, and that's where the blister comes in. So the appearance of an immediate blister is the characteristic of a second-degree burn. So in this picture right here, the palms of the hands have a second-degree burn. You still see the redness and the swelling typical, and the pain that is typically also present in a first-degree burn. It is also in a second-degree burn plus the blister. I'm going to emphasize this is an immediate blister. Sometimes first-degree burns get a blister a few hours later, but the second-degree burn is an immediate blister. A third-degree burn is the most severe. In this case, the entire thickness of the skin has been damaged, and it has been charred to a level where even the pain endings have been destroyed. So there's typically no pain. Initially, there's no edema. The color may change depending on the level of burn and the source of the burn. So it could be a greater white, cherry red. Typically, skin grafting is going to be necessary because there's no repair at that point. The entire skin has been completely destroyed. And that's a depiction of a third-degree burn, which is pretty severe. A burn is considered critical if more than 25% of the body has a second-degree burn. So 25% of the body with a second-degree burn will be considered critical. And critical means the patient is at a danger for infections, dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, which could lead to kidney damage and low blood pressure. So more than 25% would be pretty much the entire trunk, plus maybe some of the upper limb, for example. Okay, or both legs, for example, would be more than 25%. Okay, so that would be a second-degree burn that, because of its so extensive, it represents a critical burn. When it comes to third-degree burns, anything more than 10% is critical. So again, critical means infection, dehydration, kidney shutdown. 10% would mean just a whole arm being burned. That's 9%. Okay, a whole leg would be more than 10%. Okay, if the burn includes face, hands, feet, then it's considered critical. And that's because all of the important areas in the face which will make it even more serious area to get infected. Hands and feet, that's because we lose so much heat through the hands and feet. So that will give us, an added problem right there. So you should be able to describe these burns or to recognize a description of the burns, the severity, the layers of the skin that have been damaged. What do we mean by the rules of 9? And also, when is a burn considered critical? So those are the kinds of questions that you should expect from that material. So this is pretty much it for chapter 5. The last part of the chapter looks at how skin is developed, and we don't really cover that. Now we do talk, it is important to know a little bit what happens to skin as we age, to the integumentary system as we age. And it becomes dry, itchy, the sebaceous glands are not working as well anymore. The hypodermal layer is thinner, so the fat is thinner. There is less of the collagen and the elastic fibers, so the skin is less resilient. We have a less, because of the subcutaneous layer becoming thinner, there is less tolerance for cold. Wrinkles appear because of the elastic tissue and the collagen becoming thinner also. So there's a cold intolerance. There is also a risk for dehydration because the skin is thinner. So there's a problem adjusting temperature, body temperature, through the skin. There's an increased risk of cancer because there are less numbers of melanocytes, and immune system cells have decreased also. Also, there's an accumulation of damage through the years that makes an older person more susceptible to skin cancer. Let's see what else. We got all these. Yeah, we pretty much cover all these. So you should have an idea of what happens as we age with the skin and what type of conditions we need to watch out for. So an elderly patient will be more subject to dehydration, to cold temperature, to electrolyte imbalance, just because of dehydration, for example, to skin cancer also. All right, so that takes care of this chapter. I will schedule another session for chapter 6 this week.